welcome back. I'm Connie Sokol, your host of Call to Create, and we are thrilled today to have such a talented guest. We have Sam Payne with us today. Sam, hi.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So delighted. And I was just saying to him before I came on that I had been delighted to do all of this research, get on, listen to his music, and find out more about him. Just fabulous on stage and off, down to earth, and just the feel of his music is exactly him. So this is going to be joyful today. I'm going to go ahead and give you the official introduction, and then we're going to jump in and find out what he did to get started and how he's developed it into what he's created. Sam Payne is a national and international musician and storyteller. He hosts the Appleseed, the long-running BYU radio podcast featuring stories for families, and was part of the Peabody-nominated team that created Treasure Island in 2020, the serial podcast based on Robert Louis Stevenson's classic novel. As a live performer, Sam has brought his stories and songs to halls in Canada, Bulgaria, Tokyo, and from coast to coast in the United States, including performances at the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, to the nation's capital, and the National Storytelling Festival in Jonesborough, Tennessee, and the Timpanogos Storytelling Festival right here in Lehi, Utah, which is our Utah treasure. All right, Sam, let's just jump right in. You are, in music, dance, theater, they call it the triple threat, and you're like this quadruple talent is what we'll call it. You're an author, you're a singer, you're a composer, you're a storyteller, like you are the whole package. So I want to kind of unpack this a little, and let's go back to what came first. Was it the music? Was it the storytelling? Let's get to some of these roots that you started digging.
Well, I'll tell you, I grew up in the household of a folk singer. My father was a folk singer.
Martin Payne. Yeah.
Yeah. And so creative endeavor was kind of part of the household lingo since the time I was a little kid. And I think maybe the very first thing that I wanted to be was a writer. My mother brought home from the thrift store an old typewriter. And I think her intention was to give me and my little brother something to sort of take apart with screwdrivers on a summer day. But what do you know? The thing worked. And so I began to kind of tap out what turned into like 2 pages of a little crime noir novel. And those 2 pages still exist. I still keep those 2 pages among my treasures. And I went to my dad and said, how do you do this? I had dreams of at 9 years old or 10 taking my manuscript to a publishing house and them being thrilled with it, And my dad said, listen, why don't you finish this up? We'll go down to the supermarket where they have a Xerox machine, and we'll pay to have 10 or 12 copies made, and you can make some covers out of construction paper and sort of brad them together and take them around in your radio flyer wagon and sell them to the neighbors. And I didn't bite. That wasn't a big enough dream for me, right?
Yeah, that's just the neighborhood. Think bigger.
That's right. Yeah. Now it's actually one of my regrets. I wish that I had finished that manuscript, made some copies, taken it around and sold it to the neighbors, because early on I realized that it's not so much that I was after publishing success or later on music success or success on the stage as an actor or as a storyteller. What I was really after, I think, was just kind of a place at the table in what my wife calls the great conversation, and readers participate in that conversation, writers participate in that conversation, actors and storytellers participate in that conversation. And so the medium has never been as important to me as the conversation has been. And that's a branding mistake, right? What I have failed to do is kind of niche down and focus on one thing and pursue success in that way. But I feel like I've had a rich seat at that table of conversation.
Absolutely. And you have added so much to that buffet. And I think that's the thing for creatives is this need, this yearning to express their message, whether it's through art or film or music or whatever it might be. And I love when we all come to the table, it just makes that dialogue so much richer. You're so spot on. So then as you kind of went along, do I understand right that your brother gave you a guitar to get started and you kind of sang at a fireside? The ye old, I started at a fireside. Tell us about that.
Well, by the time I was a young adult, I had a lot of experience on stage as an actor and mainly as a singer in ensembles, college choirs and stuff like that, And then there was a point as a young father when I was living in St. George, Utah, and my little brother, who lived, 300 miles away and whom I hardly ever saw, came to my house. I opened my door late one night to a knock, and it was my brother who was just passing through town. And he's a very fine guitarist. And he, there on the porch, just said, "Listen, I was at a jazz competition and I won this guitar, and the rest of the family knows how to play the guitar and you don't. And frankly, we're all a little tired of it." So he handed me the guitar and essentially went on his way. But that was the beginning of me. Once I had sort of 3 or 4 chords under my belt, I could start kind of writing music. And that became my passion for many, many years. It started with a guy in my ward hearing me play the one song I knew for a youth activity. And he said, "Listen, we should have a band." That was a really wonderful exercise, because suddenly I had to bring new material to every band rehearsal. So
Mhm.
there was kind of an urgency and kind of an impetus for creating music, and creating music for an audience, which at first was just the other 2 guys in the band. So, you know,
And that makes all the difference. You've got that
right.
compelled deadline, which we all know as a creative, it's that deadline that makes us actually make it happen and get it
That's
from
right.
our mind and our heart right out onto the page.
Yeah.
I love that. And it sounds like as you went along, you had bits and pieces that you sort of Velcroed that kind of started creating this sound. Tell us about this unique sound, because it is so fun and fabulous and family friendly and folksy and all of those things. It's all
Sure.
of that together. How did you sort of ensemble all of that?
Well, I think it sort of sprang naturally from my training. My dad had been a folk musician for many years. I was, of course, interested in Americana music, but I kind of went to college under the auspices of singing in a jazz ensemble uh, at Weber
That's
State
boy.
University, my alma mater. And so I had a lot of experience singing and listening to jazz too. And so those 2 things kind of came to the table, this kind of folk impulse and this kind of jazz impulse. And so, I mean, what you got is these kind of contemporary folk tunes with scat solos.
And it's so
Yeah.
good. It's so good. And talk about branding and niching where, I love that you acknowledge that, yeah, it isn't really a spot out there that you can say, well, it's this, but a lot of creatives have that same thing. And you
Yeah.
kind of have to put a plus sign in between, well, it's folk meets jazz meets,
Yeah.
and yet it creates the sound. So how did you start feeling like you could actually put that into a marketable sound? Did it just unfold and evolve, or did you have to consciously create it?
It really did kind of unfold and evolve. I didn't have a lot of confidence, and I had no ambition of this music really finding a large audience and doing that even as an avocation. And frankly, it's, I think, that ward member who said, "Let's have a band" in the first place. He was a drummer who had played in lots and lots of bands on the West Coast and had lots of run-ins in the very early days before they became big with people who would become superstars, punk rockers and pop singers. And, he had been in this sort of LA milieu that gave him a lot of kind of a drive and ambition and vision. And his vision for the stuff I was creating was a lot bigger than mine was. But it really did kind of evolve. I think our very first gig was at a juice bar in town, and then that sort of just grew and grew and grew. But one of the things that grew along with it is, in the beginning, frankly, the lyrics were just kind of so dense that I found myself having to kind of explain the songs on stage. And that's kind of where the storytelling impulse began to kind of have its full flower. And pretty soon that sort of the patter behind the songs was a real sort of beloved part of the performance. And that's was how that began. And now that's essentially what I do on stage, is tell stories punctuated by songs.
Renaissance. That
Yeah.
is a gorgeous way to say that. I can tell you're so poetic even in the way you speak. I love for our listeners how this evolved. And it wasn't, we're going to sit down, we're going to do the 3 tips of marketing, and we're going to make that brand, right? You let it evolve organically, even though you were still being intentional in certain parts of that. And that you allowed the the explanation to become and stay a part of that experience for the audience, because it is an experience. When music becomes an experience, then suddenly we're all connected by that. It isn't just I'm standing, I'm singing, and I'm going home, and I could have
Yeah.
just done that listening to a playlist, right?
Yeah.
So with this storytelling, I want to scoot to that for a second, because really, for people listening, they know storytelling is an art form. I know you have this wonderful radio podcast as well with the Appleseed and kind of sharing stories and teaching the art of storytelling. Tell us, what are some good components of storytelling? And I will preface this with, every single creative needs to have this skill, because whether it's marketing or it's expressing your things, whether it's writing, art, film, it's a story. It's all about story. So tell us a little bit, if you would, just what makes a good story or what doesn't help a story.
Well, this is a little bit glib, and it's perhaps too glib, but for me, a great story will take me to a place I've never been and show me myself there. So I wind up going to an unfamiliar place and finding that there are things about it that are familiar, that it resonates with my own experience. So many storytelling performances are mostly about the storyteller, right?
Yes.
And and that is, I think, the downfall of a lot of storytelling. It's the storytellers trust in the notion that they are the most interesting thing in the room, when in reality, every storytelling performance is a conversation with the audience. And so receiving kind of all of the telemetry that you can get from the audience and making that a conversation rather than a performance, tracking the audience's experience with the thing that you're putting. Again, we're talking about storytelling, but it applies to my work as a musician or as an actor too. It's always a conversation, and I make a mistake when I trust that I am the most interesting thing in the room.
That is so beautifully put, because you are spot on. It makes me think of that book, Building Your Story Brand by Donald Miller. And he talks about make the audience the hero. That's what we're to do. And then they go on that hero's journey with you through that medium, whether it's art, whether it's whatever, music, whatever it might be. And that's so gorgeous that you have not only seen that, but you've kept that. And it is a sacred trust between us and an audience. And I want to move into another thing that this beautifully segues of, I think that's the gorgeousness of a live performance, is there's the electricity of
Yeah.
that connection that you're making right there, can never be re-experienced just the way you did it there. And I
Right.
know that you've mentioned that there is magic in both, in studio and on stage. And I think you likened it to, you design the car like in the studio experience, that's kind of likened to that. And then you're driving the thing on stage.
Right. That's
But
right.
there's
Yeah.
there's magic in both, right? So as you connect with your audience, what have you found that they receive the most, or are the most resonating with in what you do?
Because of my work in radio and with the Appleseed podcast, I've had an opportunity to talk to hundreds and hundreds of storytellers. And you know this, there are some kind of questions that you gravitate to asking everybody that you talk
Yes.
to, right?
Yes.
And one of the questions that I kind of gravitate to when I'm talking to storytellers, because I love the consistency of their answer, is what for you makes a good storytelling performance? How do you know that you've hit when you've been on stage?
You killed
And
it.
their answer is startlingly consistent, and I very much agree with it too. They say, we know that a storytelling performance has gone well when people are leaving the concert hall or the classroom or the festival tent or wherever they've been performing, when people are leaving that space turned toward one another, telling their stories to one another.
Mm.
That's the desired outcome, right? That's the desired outcome. And that, frankly, is, I think, what may resonate in some of the things that I do. People experience the stories that I'm telling, and it sparks thoughts or memories for them that they can share with one another as stories around the kitchen table or the living room. That's where the real magic happens.
Oh, so true. And then they're telling it, they go home to their families, and then that sparks, I remember he was doing this. And remember Aunt June? Remember that summer that we spent, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And that's where that experience, it's a connector. The storytelling and doing it through music and the way that you do it, and that folksy with the little lilt of the jazz, it just brings all of that together. And It makes you feel like you want to close your eyes and just get lost in that space, in that world for just that moment. So good. I would
That,
love
that's
to.
that's so kind of you to say it. It sort of hearing you talk is like making me a fan of my own work, which is
Man, I'm actually better at this than I thought.
that's
Seriously, sometimes it takes someone else for you to remember, oh, yeah, like people actually enjoy this. Yeah, it's not just slaving over it. I love too your easygoing manner of there's so much work that goes behind the scenes on this to make it feel and look effortless. And yet there is a thread of you, Sam, that is very organic about it and just like what you are, like what you share, just a story within you of just I'm living and enjoying this and being in the moment with this. How do you do that? What do you have a tip or a tool for that?
Well, some of that is craft, right? I have to admit that some of that is craft. And of course, behind the scenes, if I walk onto stage with a pretty easygoing manner, a storytelling festival or any other performance, but behind the scenes, I'm sort of workshopping things with my wife and kind of slaving to sort of crack open the story in the way that I like. And so again, I'm a showman, and part of that is show, right? But there are some tenets, when I walk on stage that I try to adhere to, which is, like I never try to be funny, right? For example, because comedy is hard. And if there are things in the story or the song that are funny, those things will out themselves, right? But if I'm kind of pushing them, then that becomes too artificial. And it's the same thing with pathos or emotion. If there are things in the stories or the songs that contain emotional content, those things will out themselves. I don't have to push them. And if I start to push them, then it becomes fake. It becomes artifice. And people have a very good radar for that.
Yes, and they can feel it's just uncomfortable and awkward.
Yeah.
And I agree. I feel like almost that story of Michelangelo where he said, I just revealed what was in there. A
Sure.
good storyteller reveals those things, sets the setting and allows those pieces to flourish themselves and to show themselves, like you said, rather than you're making it all work for itself. I love all of that. I'm curious too, as you've done that, just really quickly, how do you keep those stories fresh? I hear that a lot from people because I'm a speaker. And how do you keep those stories fresh, and especially from audience to audience? What's your take on that?
Well, I think I would give a different answer to this now than I would have given 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Because 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I thought that all the material did in fact stay fresh. Now I know better. There are stories or songs that you find yourself retiring, sometimes because the times have changed, sometimes because you have delivered a piece so many times that it is difficult to keep fresh and it's getting a little bit stale, and sometimes because your own interests change. And so I find myself these days looking back on kind of a long history of doing this and realizing that some stuff has dropped off. So not everything does stay fresh. But of course, on the other hand, I find myself going back to stuff that I sort of picked up 15 years ago and then laid down again, thinking that I wasn't interested in it. And I go, oh, wow, there's a seed there that I want to now nourish, right? So in answer to your question, sometimes it doesn't stay fresh. But to keep it fresh, I just have to continue to approach it authentically. I keep having to care about the things that I'm saying on stage.
So good. And taking this current facet, your current lens, and seeing that same experience through that lens and adding that new insight to it that
Yeah.
keeps that still relevant to what your audience is going to want to see or know or feel. I think
Yeah.
that's so genius. And I love that. It's almost like a great pair of like jeans that 20 years ago you just like, oh, and now it's out. But then 20 years later, it's retro and you can just spark it up and it's like, oh, okay, wow, it's a new look. It's a new look.
Yeah.
I think
And I
that's
guess, I'll say just one more thing about that. And that is that that's also where I don't have any hesitation to sort of cross idioms. So I'll be an actor for a while, and I'll be a storyteller for a while, and I'll be a songwriter for a while. And that has a way of keeping performance modes fresh, you know. Uh,
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I think it was an E.B. White that had 5 typewriters so that he was working on different projects at the same time so that he
right.
could stay fresh with when he got tired of, writing one thing, he could switch to another. And I
Yeah.
think that you're sort of this Swiss Army blade of being able to do all these different creative expressions. It's fantastic. And speaking of fresh, I was thinking about how you had done these collaborations that also keep things so fresh and add that little bit of juice and zest. I know you've done Ryan Shoup and cellist Stephen Sharp Nelson. You mentioned that Sherry Call, one of the collaborations that you had was absolutely one of your favorites. Do
Mhm.
you remember that one? Can you tell us why?
Well, Sherry is a longtime collaborator. We've spent a lot of time on stage together and made a lot of recordings together. But, you know, they say if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together, you know, and that has a manifestation in collaboration for sure, right? You can tackle bigger things when you're working with other people, though working alone allows you to kind of move at the speed of thought. There are cool things about working alone, there are cool things about collaborating, but Sherry is a wonderful collaborator. And once I sort of heard harmonies to my music in her mouth, I thought, oh, good heavens. Suddenly I was hearing my own songs in a new way. Yeah, she's a great collaborator. And she and I both belong to a little group of 6 songwriters who share an email group together and demand of each other that we write a song a week. And we share those songs not publicly, but just in this little email group. And that's been a really marvelous exercise too. That's a group to which Sherry and I both belong, but was started by a wonderful songwriter in Southern Utah named Lacey Williams.
So fabulous. Your own version of J.R. Tolkien's Inklings and C.S. Lewis.
Sure.
It's your
Yeah.
own email version of that in the musical side, right? I think
Yes.
that's phenomenal. And for those that are listening, them being able to realize that group collaboration, that feedback, that critique group, that whatever it is keeps you showing up, keeps you just like we kind of bookending with that deadline with the band. When you are a creator, you've got to create, you've got to produce because that's how you're going to shave off and rub off and kind of sand off all of those edges. And you're actually going to flourish the best parts of yourself. And I agree, the collaborative experience, there's such a place for that as a metronome of, I need that touch point of these other people to keep my things fresh, to have new ideas and new thoughts that not just my very own. Love it. I know we're winding down on our time and I would love to touch on this. The gospel and your father have seen both like a really strong woven influence through what you do. Can you talk to us about how the gospel's influenced you and then how your father has influenced you? Because both of those have seemed like really strong influences in your music.
Yeah, certainly they have. I owe a lot to the influence of my dad. We are different guys, and I approach things differently than he does, I think, from an artistic perspective. But I'd like to think we influence each other, actually. But yeah, for sure, he is an enormous part of why I do what I do. And certainly my faith is going to shine through whatever I do. I can't help that, right? That's just part of what I am and it comes through. I'm frankly not often thinking about it. I'm not often saying, I want to write a song about this aspect of the gospel or about this aspect of my faith. But I find that those things just bubble to the surface, you know. And frankly, I think that's good. I think I might be more didactic than I am if I set out to write songs about the gospel or set out to write songs about my faith. But it is behind the scenes in a lot of conversations, not so much in my personal work, but in my work at BYU Broadcasting with the Appleseed and with all of the podcasts that I oversee at BYU Broadcasting. Those podcasts, you know, because BYU Broadcasting is owned by who it's owned by, those conversations are ever present for us. And those faith conversations are a very rich part of that work and hopefully part of what people are perceiving when they listen to a BYU radio podcast, or even the Appleseed, which is my podcast that features storytellers from all over the country. Hopefully there is kind of a faith and family edge to that work that shines through.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate how you bring that up, that sometimes creatives feel like if I'm going to be doing this to build the Lord's kingdom, it's got to be handing out a Book of Mormon and doing all those things, at my performances or whatever to make that feel like. And I love the point that you make that it's woven in everything that you're doing, in the way you're approaching things and the way you're living your life. And that just, like you said, bubbles to the surface. It just comes through. And what a gift that is, that there's a feel. I've often talked to musicians that have said the thing that's their favorite part is when they have an experience with the audience. That's what they're going for. And that's such a part of the spirit, that spiritual experience, that when we weave that in, the spirit can be present and can witness of all those things and have all those good feelings and bring those good things to memory. And that's all part of it too, that isn't written in, the program, that this is a part of what you're doing.
Yeah.
If you had one piece of advice to share with the others, I know that our time is short, and I usually like to ask about a wilderness experience and a mountain experience that you've had, as you've gone along the way. Let's go ahead and take just a couple of minutes for that, and then we'll wrap up with one piece of experience, one piece of wisdom you'd like to share with them. But I would like
Sure.
to ask your choice. If you had a wilderness experience or a mountain experience that comes to mind that was pivotal for you along this journey for you to create what you've created.
Well, weirdly, the thing that I would talk about is, I think, both a wilderness and a mountain experience. My mother has for very many years suffered from deep dementia. She's a lifetime musician. She's a violinist and singer, and her musical roots run very deep. And while for several years now she hasn't been able even to complete a sentence, she can still sing. That part of her has been left to her. And so we siblings, since the kind of the beginning of the pandemic, have gotten together on Zoom every Sunday afternoon. And my mom is a part of those conversations. It's usually me and my brother who are sitting right with her. And we sing and sing and sing and sing. And she harmonizes with her beautiful, beautiful harmony, even if she can't make the lyrics. And that is where the finest, most useful, and most powerful work of my musical experience has been done, is in that room with my mother and my brother. And I wish I could reach out to the Everly brothers and say, I can't tell you what dream, dream, dream has meant to me and my brother and my mother. I wish I could reach out to Kermit the Frog and say, I wish you knew what Rainbow Connection has meant to me and my mother and my brother, And that life of that work is sort of outside the realm where people most often consume it, right? It's in the home and the hearth around the kitchen table where the work of that art is done. And so while I agree with my fellow artists that it's wonderful to have an experience with your audience in the concert hall, what I think I have learned in the wilderness and on the mountain is that the real work of that art is in equipping the listener with something that they can use in their most intimate home conversations to bolster their faith, to create ties, to create connective tissue between them and the people that they love. I feel really strongly about that, and I think I have discovered that in its finest iteration in my life in these last few years with my mom.
That is gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. And you can feel the impact that that has on her and on your family. And that's what it's all about. That is so fantastic. I am going to go ahead and ask that one last question, but we could even stop just right here and sit in that for just that moment. It's so beautiful. Is there one thing that you have felt through all of this experience, that turning to those creatives when they're in their wilderness, when they're like, I'm done, and really don't know if they should keep going? Is there any piece of advice or wisdom that you'd like to share?
I don't know that this is wisdom, right? but but I do know that the work that you're doing in making and sharing pieces of art can come back, can turn around and save you in the wilderness. I have a friend who's a storyteller who for years and years and years had told stories on stage with the fervent belief that they would change the lives of the people that he was telling stories to, and enrich them and empower them. And then he got throat cancer and couldn't tell stories on stage anymore. And for a while, he was sort of lost in that wilderness, and then said, I wonder if the things that I've been saying to audiences on stage for so many years are true. And if I can lean on those things that I've created and those stories of other people that I've told to help heal me. And he found that he could. He turned to the stories that he had enriched other people with for so long for strength in that time of throat cancer for him. He has since recovered and is back on stage telling stories, blessedly, but trusting in the power of the thing that he was doing, and not in the success of the thing that he was doing, just in the power of the thing that he was doing, turned around to heal him. And I believe that. I believe that the things that we do can heal us, can come back to us when we most need them and lift us.
Absolutely. And isn't that the core of the gospel? That's Heavenly Father and the Savior. It's never a one layer thing. It's always reciprocal and infinity loop and coming back and depth and breadth of blessing lives now and all the way down into the eternities, not to be dramatic, but truly that is how they work. I have loved getting to know you and what you do. People are going to want to know more about how they can get to know you. What's the best way for them to reach you?
The best way for them to get to know me is to listen to my podcast. There's so much fun in life and storytelling, and so much of what I'm interested in goes on there, that subscribing to that podcast, I mean, that feels like a commercial because it is one. That's
It's for a worthy cause.
that's right.
It
Yeah,
all works
yeah,
out in the wash. Yep.
yeah. I'm easy to track down. I'm on all the socials and everything else, and I'm the only one of me. So
Well, I can't wait to sit around that kitchen table with you on the Appleseed and exchange stories, hear your stories, and feel the joy of my own stories and connect that with my connective tissue and my own family. Sam, an absolute joy today. Thank you for being with us.
thanks. Such a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
And for those of you listening, if you've enjoyed this podcast, we have so much more. Dr. Stacy Taniguchi, Lisa Valentine Clark, Gerald Lund. We have so many of these amazing people who have worked their craft and done so much to share their creative expertise so that you can be helped on your creative journey, one step at a time, to be called to create.